So I don't know if you guys heard or not, but there were new Joy-Cons announced yesterday. Here's a nice picture of how they'll look like on your Switch 2. Actually, wait, that's the original Joy-Cons. Here's the actual picture of how they'll look like on the Switch 2. $100, by the way. I'm assuming they cut costs to keep the body the same color. It kind of fits with Nintendo's business policy. Take shortcuts to cut cost, charge extra because you know the corporate apologists are going to pay for it, and offer an upgrade that looks the exact same as the original. Speaking of which, here's Mario Tennis Aces and Mario Tennis Fever, and this one is $70. Also, by the way, I keep seeing people very optimistically talking about Mario Tennis Fever, as if like Nintendo learned from their previous sports titles and this is going to fix everything. 100% the exact same discussion was going on prior to the launch of every single sports title that came out, the three big ones. Tennis, golf, and soccer. And yet they always think this is going to be the start of something new. I'm kind of sad. Anyway, let's talk about the Switch 2 sales in the United Kingdom. So I previously made a video discussing the 2025 Switch 2 sales in France, and I want to do a similar type of analysis about what's going on in the United Kingdom. I'm actually not sure if there was an official number for what was sold on the launch weekend. I'm guessing that's because if they gave an actual number, it would show how poorly it did in comparison to the PlayStation 4, 5, and the Xbox Series consoles, so they had to be a bit more vague on it. But the data that we did get was that it sold nearly 2 times as much as the Switch 1 did, and that it had the best launch of any Nintendo console. So in this case, it actually did not surpass the Switch, it surpassed the 3DS because that's the one that had the best launch. It was at 113,000 units. Whereas in most of the rest of the world, the Nintendo Switch had a better launch than the 3DS. In the UK, the Nintendo Switch actually had a worse launch than the 3DS. This is a very key point here because it's meant to highlight just how poorly the Switch 1 launched in the UK. And the Switch 1 didn't only have a poor launch in the United Kingdom, it actually had a very slow start. Actually, here's a very interesting chart that I came across. This is posted on NielsenIQ.com. Taken from GfK's point of sale data. And it's a table that shows how long it took for every single console to reach 2 million units sold in the United Kingdom. The Nintendo Wii tops that table. It took just about over a year to get that done. And then all the way down at the bottom, it took 140 weeks for the Nintendo Switch to sell 2 million units in the United Kingdom. Now, what's not shown here, and I had to do some searching on the side, is the 3DS figures, which would actually slot in 2 weeks slower than the Nintendo Switch did. This post by NintendoEverything.com says that the 3DS reached 2 million in the UK, and it was posted on December 19th, 2013. The console launched in the UK on March 25th, 2011. That's 142 weeks and 6 days, so I guess 143 weeks. So it's fairly comparable. But the idea here is that the Nintendo Switch started off slower than the 3DS, and it beat it to 2 million. Meanwhile, the 3DS is obviously not even remotely close to that type of success. And yet the Nintendo Switch sold fewer units than the 3DS. The Switch, for all intents and purposes, had an extremely slow start in the United Kingdom. And we know that slow start continued for at least 140 weeks when it hit 2 million, but at some point those sales exploded. Because the Nintendo Switch, despite how far behind it lagged on these charts, eventually got to the point where it sat only a few 100,000 units behind the PlayStation 4, which obviously, as many people know, is a massive success in the United Kingdom. So logic should dictate that the popularity of Nintendo in the United Kingdom was very different at the end of the Wii U's lifetime in comparison to the Nintendo Switch's lifetime. Right, the Nintendo Switch came into a market where both the 3DS and the Wii U really struggled. And while the UK was already very much considered Sony's playground, by the time we hit 2022 and 2023, the narrative online started to shift. The discussion became less about how Nintendo was just a visitor in the UK and it was clearly Sony's land, in this case even Xbox. And as we moved closer towards the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 in the latter half of the Switch 1's life, the dialogue very much was that Nintendo can succeed in the UK, and it should succeed in the UK. It now has a massive fan base, a huge customer base of people that are willing to put their money and spend on Nintendo. It still might not sell as much as the next Sony console, but it's no longer just like this pathetic underdog in the way that the Switch 1 launched, the 3DS launched. It's a sign that it's a console that can compete with the big boys. And as such, with the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, you would expect that people would have higher expectations. It had been 8 years since the launch of the Nintendo Switch, and Nintendo has a much better image in the United Kingdom now. Buyers proved they were willing to jump in, and there's an endless amount of hype going into the launch. But despite that, there are wrongfully people assuming that the Nintendo Switch 2 has been a success in 2025 in the United Kingdom because it outpaced the original Switch by a measly 6%. That's it. It launched in the UK selling more than 2 times what the original Nintendo Switch did, and it closes off the year with only a 6% lead. That's at minimum a 44% drop in its lead, and a significant portion of that is attributed to the holidays. According to thegamebusiness.com, in the UK, for the last 8 weeks of the year, the Switch 2 sold 16% lower than what the Switch 1 managed in the last 8 weeks of 2017. That's based off of the Nielsen IQ data. It was a failure this holiday season. And to kind of give some people context for data that came out a few weeks ago, people were celebrating how good the Switch 1 plus the Switch 2 did in the UK for the holiday season. And that's a problem with these headlines that group the Switch 1 into the mix, because if you include the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 sales for 2025, they were 7% higher than what the Switch 1 managed in 2017, specifically for the holiday season, in the United Kingdom. I had people coming to my channel being like, hey, just FYI, the holidays in the UK were great. They outdid what the Switch 1 did in 2017. And sure, if you want to include last-gen consoles, that's a whole different story. How much did the 3DS sell in 2017? Maybe we should add that to the mix and see if it still matches that 7% increase. But it's supposed to be a one-to-one comparison. Brand new Switch 2 versus the brand new Switch 1 in their first holiday season, the Switch 1 sold 16% more. This is why I spend as much time as I do breaking these things down, because a few weeks ago people were convinced that the Switch 2 was doing phenomenally in Europe, where that could not be further than the truth. Now, I kind of covered this in my previous videos, but obviously I have to mention this again because I know somebody will say something in the comments if I don't. Launches align, the Switch 2 is way ahead. Obviously, in 2017, the Switch 1 launched in March. The Switch 2 launched in June, so it has 3 fewer months to work with. But just like is the case with everywhere else, if right now in the UK, the Switch 2 is only 6% higher than the Switch 1, within a very short amount of time, the Switch 1 is going to surpass the Switch 2. Unless something massive turns around for the launch-heavy numbers of the Switch 2, since they haven't done anything impressive since that launch. Something massive like a major price drop, for example. Unless that happens, in almost every single market, within the next few months, the Switch 1 is easily going to surpass the Switch 2. And we can put all of that fastest-selling talk to rest. A record for most markets that would last for less than a year. Even in Japan, mind you, the Switch 2 did not reach what the Switch 1 did in 2017. But the difference is, in Japan, which is what you would have expected on a worldwide scale for this launch, it's strictly a matter of supply. Whatever gets shipped to Japan at its lower price point gets sold. So if they had shipped more units to Japan, they would have sold more. But obviously Nintendo won't do that because they make more money by shipping them out to Western markets. So as much as I would laugh about the fact that the Switch 1's 2017 in Japan outsold the Switch 2's 2025, I actually don't think that's a big deal because it's a supply issue. And likewise, in the United Kingdom, the Switch 1, with its slow start, actually had supply constraints. Whereas in the UK, the console was on launch everywhere and never actually ran out of stock really. So it had plenty of stock and it still didn't sell as much as not only the PlayStation 4 and 5, but also not as much as the Xbox Series consoles. You would expect better for a successor to a console that sold nearly as much as the PlayStation 4. No supply constraints, plenty of stock, and still couldn't even match the Xbox Series. In any case, most estimates assume that the Switch 1 hit 700,000 units in its first year, so that's 700,000 for the Switch 1 in 2017. If it's up 6%, that's 742,000 units. So to give you an idea of just how poorly this thing has done after its launch, and how a top-heavy launch could always skew numbers, if you remove the 165,000 estimate for the launch weekend of the Switch 2 in the UK from the 742,000, that's 577,000 units sold throughout the year after the launch of the console. In contrast with the case of the original Switch, it sold 700,000 in the year and only sold 80,000 at launch, so it managed to sell 620,000 units while supply constrained, and obviously most of those sales coming into the holiday season. As per usual, prior to the November and December holiday season, the Nintendo Switch 2 had a very comfortable lead over the Switch 1. So those extra 3 months in the market didn't exactly help the Switch 1, because most of the sales come in the holiday season. But walking out of the holidays, it's only a 6% lead, and the Switch 1 had an upwards trajectory, while the Switch 2 continues to show clear signs of slowing down. Now, of course, as per usual everywhere else, I think this has showed very clear signs of slowing down since the console's launch. But with the UK, it's even more interesting because unlike many other countries, most other countries in the rest of the world, the console launch was not record-breaking. Like, even with all of the extra stock that was sent into the UK like everywhere else, it didn't sell out in the same way that it did everywhere else. And it's actually a very big outlier in that regard. Like here in the States, for example, it took until around mid-August for demand to be satiated. In the UK, it happened immediately, so you wouldn't expect nearly as big of a drop-off. Seems like it just had a very slow start and had nowhere to go but up. But of course, there were signs. As early as, July, they started talking about how the PS5 was doing much better than the Switch 2 already. You know, you're looking at a 5-year-old console that's had price increases and has already been selling fairly well in the UK. And both the Switch 2 and the PS5 were coming off of fairly equal consoles in the Switch 1 and the PS4. So you'd think that 5 years in, the Switch 2 would be able to at least outpace the PS5. Not necessarily by much. After all, you know, the Sony consoles are still very popular in the UK, but at least enough where it would keep pace ahead of the PS5. But as soon as people started noting this, they started getting cold doomers and being told to shush, and that it's like, you don't understand the market. Switch 2 is outpacing what the Switch 1 did in 2017. The supply-constrained, slow-starting Switch 1 did in 2017. So it was the same thing as usual. There are clear signs that indicate that this is going to lead to a poor holiday season, and right now even, it's eventually going to lead to the Switch 1 surpassing the Switch 2 in the UK probably fairly soon. But the head's in their sand, and they're just calling everybody a rage baiter, including Chris Dring, who's the guy that shares this data, as if he's some random schmo. Like, you want to call me a grifter because I'm talking about how the Switch 2 is failing? I don't agree, but I get it. I'm going after the Nintendo console that you love, and I'm just a random dude online who's talking about it, so like, I get why you would be incorrect in assuming that I'm grifting. But now it's like, let's discredit the guy completely that's actually been sharing this factual data for years now. Well, give it a matter of time. They're gonna do the same thing to Matt Piscatella. The Sony fans did after the Ghost of Yotai released when people were boycotting that. So now when Matt turns around and starts talking about how the Switch 2 is not doing well in the States, they're gonna call it engagement bait. Although in fairness, Matt kind of steps on eggshells to not make Nintendo look too bad in the headlines, so it might not get to that point. But regardless of what information is shared and who's sharing it, automatically the Nintendo fans have a tendency to put their heads in the sand and they just assume that everybody's out there to get Nintendo. And then every week when the Famitsu numbers show up, they go and talk about how great the Switch 2 is doing in Japan and it makes them feel warm and cuddly. Then it's the endless cycle with them. The Nintendo fan holy scripture, the Famitsu numbers. Anyway, the PS5 outselling the Switch 2 was not really the only sign of concern that should have been seen by people. As per usual, the price drops play a very huge role to this. So as I've previously highlighted in my channel, when France offered some discounts, it was already a bit of a reach to assume that the Switch 2 was selling well over there, and now we've kind of proven that it wasn't. But all the corporate Nintendo faithfuls had argued that the market was very competitive in France, and France was like an exception, and they always do these discounts, even though they don't. Not that early into a console's life. And basically they were like, yeah, it'll happen here, it won't happen anywhere else. It's impossible to happen everywhere else. Mind you, prior to the discounts in France, they were also saying it's impossible to happen in France in the first year. But in fairness, even now with the discounts that are happening in the States, they still, you know what? No, I'm not getting to that right now. Anyway, not long after the discounts happened in France, the first discounts started to show up in the United Kingdom. And once again, the masses just pleaded that this was nothing more than just competition. It's because they know it's in demand and it's going to sell so well that these companies can afford to doing these discounts. It was such a foolish thought back then, and even now looking back at the sales numbers and how poor it did in the holiday, like they're still in denial about this. We all lived through every single one of these recent console launches. These discounts don't happen like this, not immediately, not for something that's in demand. But they said that in France it was normal and it won't happen everywhere else. And then it happens in the UK and the same thing. They're just like, oh, yeah, this happens. Who cares? Like, it's not a big deal. Oh, are you against discounts? That's like their argument. They tried to normalize it and just completely deny that the Switch 2 is probably not going to be having a good holiday season. And not just that, they're just in denial that the Switch 2 sales were slowed down in general. I mean, in the UK, even the launch wasn't that big. It was already slow. But still, like, even the headlines, what does it say here? The Switch 2 gets a rare UK discount. You always see these things with the price drop for the Switch 2, and we've been seeing them all year. In every market that gets a discount or a price drop, they always say it's rare. They say it's unexpected. They say it's not normal. But again, these were all very clear indications of Switch 2 sales numbers slowing down. And now that we've gotten data for this holiday season, we're seeing that that was the case. That people do not want to buy the Switch 2, because even with these discounts, granted they're not big enough discounts for people to be motivated, it's not really fixing anything yet. We need something more sizable. An official price drop from Nintendo. These 5 to 10% off retail discounts just aren't gonna cut it. It's gonna have to be like 25 to 30% off if you want to move units at a good momentum. The 3DS had to go all the way to 32%. I don't know, something tells me Nintendo's just gonna wait this out, show up at the financials, highlight that they shipped out more than 15 million units already worldwide. That should be fairly easy. They were at 10.36 at the last quarterlies. They've done 1.7 million in Japan alone since then. So I think they easily shipped out 3 million units worldwide outside of Japan leading up to the holiday season. That's not even including the Pokemon sales in October, because I think that 10.36 that we saw last time, at least 1.5 million of that was in preparation for Pokemon, which was going to launch in 2 weeks. I think easily, on a worldwide scale, if you consider every single retailer and what they expected for the Switch 2 to do this holidays, add them all up together, minus Japan, they easily had 3 million shipped out in preparation for the holidays. Right, because it's not like these companies are going to be ordering it on December 7th. They're going to get everything they need for that holiday season right off the bat prior to mid-November. So I think there's zero chance that the Switch 2 is not already at least at 15 million shipped. And if it's already at 15 million shipped, as long as they keep pumping out units to Japan at the same rate that they did for the last couple of months, it's very easy going to reach its 19 million forecast. This is why I keep repeating that in comments and in various videos. I think Nintendo still easily hits that forecast, because even though they've overshipped on a worldwide scale at this point, they still have Japan. It's just important for people to understand it before the financials come out in February. And we deal with a similar situation as last time. The latter half of August, September, and October were all slow. But when the quarterlies came out on September 30th, the numbers said 10.36 million. And of course they did, because most of that was shipped out by the time we got to July. And right now it's going to say 15 million. And of course it will, because most of those will have been shipped prior to the holiday season. The difference is this February quarterly, that's kind of the last straw. The only way the number goes up beyond this February quarterly that we see, and that February quarterly is only going to cover up until December 31st, is either with a price drop or with a huge tilt in Japan's favor. This is why it's been very important to track the shipped versus sold numbers, because right now we know undoubtedly that the Switch 2 has undersold significantly more than anybody could have possibly imagined in the holiday season, especially the retailers. After the PS5 and the Xbox holidays that they've seen for the past few years, and especially like the Nintendo holidays, its slowdown, where it was like at its worst, did better last year than what the Switch 2 accomplished this year. There is zero chance that all of these retailers are not sitting at almost twice as many units as what was sold, if not more. So while this upcoming quarterly is going to look good, this is the last one that's going to look that good without a massive price drop. Or, like I said, a massive tilt towards Japan. This is the direction we've been trending in since June. And I think finally people are starting to open their eyes to this realization. In any case, in my next video, I'm going to discuss the year one in Spain. That'll be a fun one. There's been a lot of talk about Spain this year. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time.